Unscripted, the audio podcast where we confront the final frontier, death, with curiosity, courage, and compassion. Today's guest is Dr. Casarett, MD, MA, FAA, HPM, Professor of Medicine at Duke University, Chief of Palliative Care at Duke Health, and a member of the Duke Cancer Institute. He is a nationally recognized palliative care physician and health services research, with more than 100 articles published in leading journals, including JAMA and the New England Journal of Medicine. His writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the Newsweek, Salon, and Wired. Dr. Casarett is the recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the highest honor given by the U.S. government to early stage researchers. His latest book, Undiscovered Country, A Doctor's Travel Guide to the End of Life, which is what we're going to be focusing on in this podcast, reframes dying not as a single event, but as a profound journey, one shaped by biology, design, and meaning. In this conversation, we'll explore the really happens in our final hours, how patients can design their end-of-life experience, and why death deserves a seat at the healthcare table. This is not a conversation about endings. It's about understanding the terrain of our last moments so we can live more fully now. I'm Paula. I'm the host. So let's go ahead and begin. I'm going to jump right in, Doctor. Good day. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Great to be here. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. And thank you so much for being my first guest in season 4.
My
I am
pleasure.
so honored. We're going to
Me too.
start
Looking forward to
off.
this.
We're going to start off with the journey of dying. In Undiscovered Country, you frame death as a journey through a foreign land. Why did you choose that metaphor?
Well, there's sort of a simple motivation as there is behind lots of books, which is usually not the obvious one or the one that authors brag about first, second, or third. But I'm a big fan of travel. I'm a big fan of travel narratives. Always wanted to write a travel book. For some reason, publishers didn't really think that a doctor could write a good travel book, so never got any traction there. And so I thought I would try to sneakily write a travel book that wasn't a travel book that publishers might want to publish. So this is my thinly disguised travel book that I got under the wire, framing it as a book about death and dying, but it's at least half a travel book. That's kind of the slightly almost facetious answer, but it's totally true. I think maybe the more important answer and the one that's more relevant to readers is that there's a lot, as I try to make the case, there are a lot of parallels between traveling and dying. Dying is arguably kind of the greatest travel metaphor, going back to Freud, who talked about dying as a train journey. Or J.K. Rowling has Professor Dumbledore talk about dying as the last great adventure. So there's definitely that resonance out there. That's how we think about dying. There's really a more practical reason, which is, we've all traveled, we've all taken trips, we've all experienced the uncertainty, the anxiety of traveling, and also curiosity of traveling. And so I hoped, and maybe this is a forlorn hope, but I hoped by framing death and dying in terms of something that we've all experienced, with all the advantages and disadvantages of travel, that would be a way to normalize it a bit, or at least to give people a frame that resonates, that's familiar. Because I think if there's one goal for this book, it's giving people an understanding of at least as far as we know, what happens in the last days and hours of life, to try to demystify that. And I was hoping that framing a metaphor in terms of something that people are experienced with would help at least get 1 or 2 feet down the road of that journey toward accepting death as something that's certainly foreign, but something that doesn't necessarily need to be fear inspiring any more than a trip overseas needs to be fear inspiring.
Well, I just love it. That was the first thing that grabbed me, was that metaphor, because I do believe that when we get to the dying part of our lives. It's the travel, it's the journey from birth until now. And now you're just, it's the next adventure into whatever the next destination is. So it really, when I first read the metaphor and everything, it fit perfectly into how I see the journey of getting to the death part as an adventure, as a travel, so to speak.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
what do you know? What do we actually know about the biology of dying? What happens in our final hours?
Well, it's a really interesting question. We know a lot up to a point. Um, and that's why the one way in which the travel metaphor is helpful. You know a little bit about what happens in the days, hours, minutes leading up to death. But that in the Shakespeare line that I used in the title and the book is really undiscovered country from which no one returns to tell tales, which isn't quite true, by the way. There are a few people who have gone quite a few steps down that path and have made it back. But I think what that means is that although there are certainly some mysteries, like what we're going to experience, what we're going to be aware of, what we're not aware of in those final moments, there are a few insights there, but that's pretty mysterious. The real biology, physiology of what happens at the cellular level, we actually know a fair amount about, because all of that, or a lot of that, happens in the dying process. And we know a lot about it because, as a doctor, even as a palliative care doctor, we spend a lot of time trying to keep people alive. And so over the last probably 30 or 40 years, there's been, arguably much longer than that, but really intensified over the last 30 or 40 years, a lot of attention to trying to keep people alive in those last minutes. And so there's been a huge incentive to learn as much as we can, looking for processes that we could divert, or processes of disintegration that we could arrest, things that we could fix to bring people back. And I think one of the big overarching themes of what happens in the last hours, for sure, but extending back days, sometimes weeks, is that our bodies gradually begin to shut down. And by that I mean they use energy in a different way. And as we get closer and closer to death, there are a lot of signs and symptoms of bodies shutting down. People become less alert, less awake, often, but not always. um, and organs stop working as they did. And there's some really, I could even use the word clever, I guess, clever ways that the body has figured out how to protect us. One of the most prominent ones is that the body seems to know as we're dying that we don't need energy, we don't need food, we don't need liquids, and our GI tract, for instance, begins to shut down because your body recognizes that you really don't need to eat. There's no point of that now. And so, at a time when we're really often physically unable to eat, our body tamps down our appetites. So, when I have this conversation with families all the time, somebody who's nearing the end of life is not eating and not drinking, and the family's really, really worried that that person is starving to death. And it's not the lack of food or water that's causing their death. It's advanced heart failure or liver disease or cancer or whatever else is going to take their lives. But in a brilliant move, the body is really pretty adept at recognizing that trajectory as it moves toward the end of life, realizing that you can't take in any food, and it reduces your appetite. So, right at that point where you're unable to eat, your body is telling you, don't be hungry, don't worry about it, you're fine. And that's, I think, part of a much larger web of mechanisms that the body puts in place without getting too mystical about it. Our body is really pretty good at protecting us from pain and symptoms near the end of life. Often alertness is decreased. Um, and it's a process of rearranging energy, putting energy where it's most needed in the heart, the brain, circulatory system, taking blood flow out of the extremities. So extremities often get cool until at the very end, even your brain can't get enough blood to function adequately. And people become confused and delirious. But it's really this intricate mechanism the body has, both to keep the body going as long as it can, but also to protect us from uncomfortable symptoms, which doesn't always work, obviously. And a lot of what we do in palliative care is to try to make people comfortable with medications and non-pharmacologic approaches. But the body does a pretty darn good job on its own. And it certainly left me with researching this book, even though I was a palliative care doc and have taken care of lots of people near the end of life. Researching this book really has given me a new appreciation for just how well designed our bodies are.
Yeah, my when I was growing up, and my mother and my grandmother were both very attuned in my family to the dying. They were the caregivers, the caretakers, but they were also what we call death doulas today. They were just the
Yeah.
ones that were around that area. But my mother used to tell me that as a child that the body that we carry is a beautiful bioorganic machine that nature created, and it knows how to take care of itself. The soul being, or the energy essence, whatever you want to call it, that's inside of it. And I always detuned it, as growing up, when we saw the Men in Black kind of deal, where the little alien's sitting in the body kind
Yeah.
of deal.
Yeah.
That just is a picture for me. So when I am confronted with families, like you said, I always tell people, you have to imagine that, we have this beautiful bioorganic body that is was designed for birth, but it was also brilliantly designed for death. And it, like you said, it just kind of knows what to do, and we just kind of are the passenger at this particular juncture, managing the pain and that kind of stuff. And the other thing is, when people ask me, one of the things when I do death talks and stuff is people say, well, what happens when you die? Where do we go? And I always tell people, I don't know. I don't do that part. That's not a gift I was given in this world.
Yeah.
I walk people up to the point of the veil, so to speak, and then whatever happens. But I do tell people, no one has ever knocked on my door and said, don't die. It's horrible. Being dead is awful. Don't, do everything in your power. So, like you said, I kind of figure that it's I've watched this go on long enough, and I do believe that the body is, it's just so brilliant, and there's so much that we haven't learned yet. Some of it's just above our pay grade right now, or our brain,
Exactly.
grade, if you will. So,
Yep.
okay. What are some of the most common misconceptions about the dying process, do you think?
I mean, I'll knock off a couple of the easy ones. I think people are really, really worried that dying is going to be painful, um, either in the very last moments or in the time leading up to it. And often that fear is well founded. Somebody who has been in and out of cancer treatment for the last 4 or 5 years, has gone through some unpleasant procedures, surgeries, toxic chemotherapy, has had a lot of suffering, um, that wasn't managed well. It's logical to assume that death is just going to be yet another, but it doesn't need to be. None of that suffering needs to happen. And a lot of what we do, as I said, in palliative care is really focus on symptoms, because
Yeah,
if we don't relieve symptoms like pain, nausea, shortness of breath, like all the other work, thinking, feeling, connecting that we all try to do near the end of life, it can't happen. People talk about doing a life inventory and taking stock, and those sorts of meaning focused exercises, which is totally valuable and I'm convinced is exceptionally helpful. But it's not possible if you've got 10 out of 10 pain from metastatic
yeah,
cancer. So
I
we
agree.
usually think of a hierarchy of needs, like you've got to manage those first. And we can manage those symptoms just as easily in the last moments of life as we can for somebody who's going through a bone marrow transplant 4 years earlier. So it doesn't have to be painful.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think the other misconception that people have, well, one I just alluded to, which is, or maybe a variant of that, people don't realize that your body really does shut down and it needs less energy. It wants less energy near the end of life. Appetite is decreased. People really don't want to eat often. And yet, a misconception people have is, well, she's got to eat to keep her strength up. Like, no, really, she doesn't. She's got
Yeah.
metastatic cancer. She's probably got 1 or 2 days left to live if we're really lucky. And I would never, ever dissuade somebody from trying to eat if they had an appetite, or, families coming in and it's a birthday and having a bite or two of birthday cake. Totally, totally fine.
But the
Would encourage
day-to-day
that. And
need of
right,
eating and drinking is no longer a priority for the body. I mean,
exactly. And family members feel that's an obligation. I mean, if there's a
yeah,
patient sitting there in a hospital bed, their grandmother, and she's not eating, like most kids and grandkids would feel compelled to make sure that if she's not eating what's on the tray, then we'll bring her something from Bojangles,
yeah,
or we'll make something at home, or we'll give her something that she can eat. All with the best of intentions. Like they're trying to be supportive. They're trying to do
yeah,
exactly what we would do for another human being. But in that moment, it's not helpful.
yeah.
And then the other misconception I see a lot, less misconception and more like a misplaced hope. If you watch deaths on TV, it's kind of a
Yeah.
weird way to start a sentence, but if you watch deaths on TV, you'll notice that people have this tendency to stay awake and alert until the very end. They utter last words, they offer forgiveness, they do all the other things. It's like script writers want to get the most mileage they possibly can out of that character. And so they have them in a speaking role up until the very end. And that happens sometimes. Maybe more often than I think, because I work in a hospital where there are lots of medications that make people sleepy
Right.
and sometimes confused. So maybe it happens more in the home, but I would say probably not more than 1 in 10 people is awake and alert enough to have a conversation near the end of life. And that's not a bad misconception to have, except that it leads people maybe to not appreciate those lucid moments as much as they should. And
Yeah.
by that, I mean, having seen lots of people subside into unconsciousness in the last days or hours of life, if I see a patient who's awake and alert with family members, um, my advice usually is to like some version of, well, y'all can talk now. Like, do it. Talk now while you can, because a day from now, your mother, grandmother, father, uncle may not be able to talk. So if there are things that need to be said or discussed or talked about or laughed about, do it now. Because this level of lucidity isn't promised and may not be with us in a couple of hours or a day.
Yes, I agree. In all my experience, I've seen a few people that have managed to, talk until their very last breath, but the family's members tell me that's their personality anyways. They're just a talker, period. You have to tell them to be quiet at some point. So it was perfectly normal in the families that they should,
Right.
die with an unfinished sentence. But for the most part, you're right. When they have that last surge or those little in and out moments in the final days and weeks, so to speak, even hours, um, I do tell people when they're lucid and awake, just like you, talk. Anything that you want to say it now, and please listen, because what the dying person is saying, they're probably not going to come around and say it again.
Right.
This is a one-time ticket show, so pony up kind of deal. Okay. Great. So let's talk a little bit about death by design. You write about death by design. What does that mean for patients and families?
Well, I mean, sometimes I almost wish I hadn't used that phrase, because I think it gives
I was
people
wondering about that.
more optimism than maybe is really justifiable about how much we can control our end of life. I use that in a very specific way, and I think it's totally legit. I don't think it was made up just for for the purpose of selling books. Because if I did it for that reason, that was not very successful. But I think we all have some choice over how we're going to die, and that seems kind of obvious, I guess. But I don't think we give it quite as much thought as we could or should, because to give you one example, we're likely going to die with several diagnoses. Very few of us will live to the ripe old age of 95, develop metastatic cancer, and be otherwise totally healthy. We just tend to accumulate diseases as we get older, like travelers accumulate souvenirs. It's just every country we get another little statue or rug or hat or whatever. And so by the time we're ready to die, unless you're unfortunately somebody who's in their 20s and has a sarcoma, otherwise healthy. And so how we manage one condition, whether it's diabetes or renal failure or heart failure or cancer, affects what we're going to die of. You have cancer, advanced heart failure. You treat the cancer, well, there's a good chance you're going to die of heart failure. You don't treat the heart failure, then you'll probably die of that rather than cancer. And I think that's really useful to keep in mind, because a lot of what we do in palliative care, in addition to symptom management, is to help people make decisions, not about that per se, but decisions about what's the overall plan.
Right.
And that's usually some language that I use in talking to patients once I've gotten to know them a little bit. Because if you have kidney disease that's likely to end in renal failure, and cancer that's unfortunately likely to take your life in a month or two, and other conditions like advanced heart disease, I think there's some really important choices to make. If it were just one of those, then most people would say, yep, just treat it, like whatever it takes, heart transplant, chemotherapy, whatever, like bring it on. But when you've got multiple conditions, then I think there's a need and an opportunity to be more strategic. And in the book, I use the example of somebody who had advanced heart failure and advanced renal failure and made the decision. It was a very, you could say, cold, but calculating and logical decision about how she would rather die. Would you rather die of heart failure or renal failure or cancer? And she made the decision that she would rather die acutely, suddenly of a cardiac arrest than more slowly with cancer. Other people might make a different decision. The point is not that she made the right decision, but that she made the right decision for her. At least I hope she did. But really more that she looked at her options and she made a decision. And she decided to die acutely of coronary artery disease as opposed to slowly from cancer. In the same way that somebody else might decide, there's a lot of things I still need to do. Heart disease, death by heart disease is pretty unpredictable. I might be feeling fine and then I might be dead the next day. And given everything I need to do and everything I want to tell people, I don't want that uncertainty. I want a little bit of warning. I want to know when death is getting closer. And that's going to be easier for me to do when I've got cancer than something like coronary artery disease. So I'm going to get my coronary artery disease treated and then to make sure that I die of cancer. Like neither one is the right decision, but I take care of people all the time who at least go a little ways down that road and think about what could I get treated and how. And maybe it's not all or none. Maybe it's I'm not giving up on treatment for cancer, but I'm going to take some low toxicity, less effective chemotherapy to buy me a little bit more time. But I would really rather die of cancer than something else like liver failure. So I'm going to work on treating that. We can maybe not design our deaths, but we could at least imagine a blueprint or a map, and then follow it as much as we can.
I totally agree with you on that. I talk to a lot of people, like you said, they have multiple things going on. I think in my entire experience of doing all this, I've maybe had a handful of people who just died of natural old age, where just, everything, they weren't really sick or anything. They just, one day, they were 94, woke up and said, okay, I'm kind of done. And that night they were dead, but that's very
Mhm.
few.
Right.
And I do believe in death by design. I talk to a lot of my patients about that, especially when they get, like you said, the renal failure and congestive heart failure, all these deals. And I do the same thing. I tell people, you don't, to have a plan that we're going to follow, that's very hard to do because we're just not that, we just don't have a full consensus on how that whole happens. But when you are asked someone, and I do ask my people, which would you rather die from? Like you said, would you rather um, die from the heart disease or the cancer? And most people, like you said, they do talk about time. It is a time factor for them. And the other people too, I think when I ask a lot of my people, and I ask them, why did you choose the heart over cancer. And a lot of them just said that they seem to think that the heart failure, going into cardiac arrest would be a simpler, gentler way to go than trying to manage cancer sometimes. So I think it's an individual thing. I don't think it's a right or wrong thing. I think it's a momentary thing that only the dying patient can choose. And I don't think any of us, can really um, be a part, understand that whole logic or whatever it is they're using, because we're not there yet. But I do think it's a great blueprint for people who are in the family and watching it. I think it gives us the future generations, a great way to look at death and say, look, I remember when grandma said this, or I remember when dad did it this way. So I think it's a beautiful thing when we talk about death by design and everything. I think it's a beautiful thing when we talk about death anyways.
Yeah, I agree. Although the one thing I would add to what you said is, yeah, I think the individual patient is the only one who can really make that decision.
Hmm.
I just, without being overly paternalistic, I want to make sure that they understand at least as well as it's possible to understand what's at stake and what's
Absolutely.
going on. I've had plenty of people say, "Look, I don't want to treat my heart disease because I would rather die suddenly in my sleep than slowly, painfully of cancer."
Hmm.
And that's a valid opinion, but I just want people to know that we can actually manage pain, not 100%, not 100% of the time, but we can do a pretty good job
Yeah.
of managing pain. So don't be too worried about that. And oh, by the way, if you die suddenly in your sleep, is there anything you still need to do? Anything left
Yeah.
unsaid, left
That's what
undone
I
because you
say.
don't have a chance? So it's their choice for sure. But I think part
Right.
of our job as clinicians is to help people think through those choices and come up with something that really is genuinely what they would want.
Absolutely. I think you have to build the story. You have to
Right.
show them the movie that's going to play out for them in whatever they do. And I tell people, this is your last stage appearance. It's your movie. It's the ending of your movie, and you're the star. And all these people, the clinicians, your caregivers, your family, they're the supporting cast. But you're the most important person in the room. And I firmly believe that being that, as doctors and clinicians and death doulas, death walkers, whatever it is that you're doing, it is kind of our place to lay the scene, for what's going to transpire so that the actor can truly, or the dying person in this case, can truly be and do to their most, not only to what is sacred to them and whatever they call ceremony and ritual, but also, like you said, to have the kindest, most compassionate exit that they can through pain management and everything. And I think that's just, how we support at the end of it.
Yeah, and
So,
I love you use the phrase about a last performance. My first book was called Last Acts. It was about how people choose to live, use whatever time they have left. And one of my agents at Ross and Yoon, then Anna Spruill, suggested a title for that book instead of Last Acts. She was arguing for Posing for Eternity, which didn't make the cut, unfortunately, with Simon and Schuster. But I've often thought that would probably have been a better title and much more in line with what you're suggesting.
yeah. Okay. How can people actively shape their end of life experience?
Again, I think it comes down to having realistic expectations.
Hmm.
There's so much you can't predict, and even more that you can't control. Um, so any discussion about shaping that end of life experience has to come with some guardrails and some realistic expectations. I think of
Gotcha.
it sort of as a kind of equivalent to a birth plan in a way. Like you don't really know what's going to happen when you pop into the car and drive like crazy people to the hospital at 3 in the
Right.
morning. Um, but you can certainly set some parameters, and those parameters often are, really don't want an epidural unless they absolutely have to. Really, 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 really want to avoid a C-section, and other things that people specify. So I think thinking of it in those terms, there's the obvious, well, let's plan death the way we plan birth, I guess. But it's I think really more an analogy that resonates with people, because I think everybody has kind of, anybody who's had kids at least has come up with a birth plan either in their head or in writing, and seen some of it play out and a lot of it not. Like my wife and I had this elaborate birth plan, and it turned out that none of that became relevant because she had to be induced. So all that went out the window, but there still was a planning process. And I think, that also lets us talk a little bit about what caregivers can do and what role they can play. Right. Because I think part of a caregiver's role is to remember that birth plan or death plan, realize that the territory we're in now doesn't really make that relevant, but they can still advocate. They can say, look, I know we had talked about this program of natural birth, and it looks like that's not going to be possible, but let's try to salvage some of it. Let's see if we can do at least some things that are on this list. When often, whether it's a woman who's pregnant or somebody who's dying, they're not, honestly, a lot of the time in a position to advocate for themselves. But having somebody else who knows what's important to that person, has talked about it, can help to advocate. And maybe that's as simple as mom really didn't want to die in a hospital. And now she's in the hospital. That's kind of a classic example. Like somebody winds up in the hospital very near the end of life, didn't want to die in the hospital, but stuff happened. She got really short of breath. She fell at home. Somebody called 911, took her to the emergency room. The whole time the family's saying, well, she didn't want to go to the hospital, didn't want to go. But like EMS is EMS, and they need to keep people alive unless they have strong instructions to the contrary.
Unless they have a resuscitate order or something along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah. And so lots of times we take care of a lot of people in the hospital who really didn't want to be there for their final admission. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how we could better shape healthcare systems to honor people's wishes. So I'm not being nihilistic about it. But when they're there, the question then becomes, okay, I know you didn't want to be in the hospital. You are in the hospital. So what do we do now? Can we make this as comfortable as possible? Can we try to get you home? Could we get you to another setting? But again, having family members who can advocate and say, remember, she really didn't want to be here. What can you do to make this right?
Yes, I think that the whole caregivers in the family is a key component in this death by design, so to speak. And, I always tell people, people always tell me, oh, I have a plan. I have a plan. I said, and do you have a plan B and a plan C too?
Exactly.
This isn't just a one-way, a one-path deal. I said, the way that humans are designed, the way, we live our lives in this particular time and space on Earth, so much occurs. We have disease and we have deterioration of the body and, just things that happen. The longer we are here and we use the body, the more it gets close to its expiration date, period. Yep. And so I agree with you wholeheartedly that, when you have to be adaptable and you have to be able to adjust. And in order to do that, you have to have what I call a tribe. You have to have a group of people who can advocate for you. And that includes everything from, the caregiver who's personally there 24/7 usually, to the family, the outlying family members. But it also includes all of a sudden now the hospital people now are involved in the plan as well. And I think that, for the most part, it is what it is. It's like anything in life. You can have the best laid out plan. You can say your child's going to, go here and be this and be that. And by 25, but life gets in the way all the time. So best laid plans, as my mom used to say. Okay, let's talk a little bit, and I'm going to just shorten this one up a little bit, but let's talk about medicine's role in death. What does modern medicine get wrong about dying?
Well, one of the biggest things we get wrong about dying is thinking that we can always avert it. And most of the time we can. And we're getting much, much better at that. And even as a palliative care doc, every week I'm on service, there are a couple of times where I find myself saying, look, I know this seems pretty grim, but another round of chemotherapy, um, we actually might be able to cure this, or if we can't cure this, we could give you 5 good years. So I find myself talking myself and patients into treatment more than I ever would have thought I would have done as a palliative care doc. Um, but putting that aside, the fact that we always try to treat people, sometimes to a point that's way past where we should have stopped and focused on comfort care. I think right in the dying experience, even when clinicians realize that a patient is dying, we still have this tendency to meddle. We just can't leave well enough alone. It's almost like we've been managing this person's cancer for 5 years. We've gotten them through a lot of crises. We've finally decided that the cancer is going to take their life, and we're going to focus on comfort care. And we take that same very well-meaning, but often misguided, meddlesome spirit and try to manage somebody's fluid and appetite and pain with the same rigor that they manage the person's cancer therapy and radiation therapy
Gotcha.
And white count. And so there's so many times when, well, somebody's not eating, so we'll give them artificial nutrition through a feeding tube or by vein, which is often way too much fluid and nutrition for kidneys or the GI tract to handle. Mm-hmm. And so people get nauseated, they start throwing up, or they aspirate some of the tube feeding liquid, escapes from the stomach and then goes down the throat into the lungs. People get volume overloaded because the kidneys can't get rid of all that. But then it continues. Like we give somebody artificial nutrition and they get volume overloaded because they've got heart failure. Then we give them a diuretic to get rid of the fluid. And then their potassium drops, so we have to give them potassium. And all with the best of intentions, we're trying to make them comfortable. But often I need to remind people to just stop, take a deep breath. There's a famous saying, I don't know who came up with it. It probably predates palliative care, but we often say, don't do something, just stand there. Yeah. Because not forever, we're not nihilists. We don't just ignore our patients. We're very active in treating, but sometimes you just have to take a breath and say, okay, what are we really trying to do here? Is the fact that her fluid is building up, is that really, do we need to give her IV diuretics? The fact that she's not eating, do we have to give her artificial nutrition? Is that really the best thing to do? So I think, all this is done with the best of intentions, but we can make people sometimes very uncomfortable by trying to chase symptoms and chase lab values. Even in the setting of comfort care, we know this person's going to die, but we keep feeling the need to do something. And so I think sometimes my advice is just to hold off, to wait, to think, to talk with the patient and family about what their priorities are, and to be much more intentional rather than having what are often for many of us as clinicians, a knee-jerk response. Not eating, got to have a feeding tube. Overloaded, got to have diuretic.
Well, I think the word intentional is fabulous. And I think that should be the mindset in a lot of the medical industry is what's the full intention, not only of you, but also of the dying person. So I love that word, by the way. I love when doctors use that word. It makes me feel at ease somehow, it shows me that they can step outside of that, as well intentioned and as caring and loving it is, but they can step out of that temporary knee jerk for a minute and just, be still, is like you said. Okay. What changes would you like to see on how medical professionals are trained to talk about death?
I mean, it's partly how they talk and partly how they view death, because you can say all the right words about death, but if your body language and your tone indicates that you're to the patient that you're not really comfortable talking about this, then patients sense that in a second. And whatever you're saying about, oh, we can keep you comfortable and this is what a plan of comfort care would look like. If doctors are nervous, sometimes that's read correctly, sometimes that's read incorrectly. Like I've had situations where a resident would go in and talk with a patient about their dying, and they were so nervous and on edge. Then I would come in later and have to do cleanup because the patient was convinced that. One patient told me that this resident was so nervous when she was talking about me and death and dying. Was there some mistake made in surgery? Did you guys screw up? Because she was so nervous. I figured she was guilty about something, which she wasn't at all. She was just really, really uncomfortable. So I think some of it is just practice and taking a deep breath. And it's also being direct. I was in another family meeting with a fellow in surgery, and I forget the exact wording, but it was something like we were talking about an older lady who had not done well in surgery, had some other diagnoses, and said, I think if your mother doesn't get better in the next day or two, we're looking at a potential mortality. And then she went on to say something more specific, and just reading the room and the body language of the family that was around, it was pretty obvious they had no idea what she was talking about. And I wouldn't have either. If she had just said, "Look, I'm hopeful she's going to make it, but I'm worried that she's going to pass away. I'm worried that she's going to die," that would have gone over well, but or not well, but people would have understood it and they would have accepted it. But the fact that she didn't want to use the D word and wanted to talk about a mortality, which isn't even grammatically correct, threw them for a loop. And we actually had to spend some time going back, and I had to interrupt and say, look, I think what we're trying to say is some version of what I said before. I think if your mother things don't turn around in the next 24 hours, I'm really worried that she's not going to make it out of the hospital and she'll die here. And this is what that family was thinking. This is what they were worried about. They didn't want to hear it, but it was what they were thinking. And when what they heard was some unintelligible jargon, it just made a bad situation much worse. So if there's one single piece of advice I could give clinicians, it's like, don't be afraid to use the dying word. Or I practice in North Carolina. I think people tend to be a little bit more traditional here. Sometimes we'll say when somebody passes away rather than when they die. But it's the same philosophy that you got to be direct, because there's enough emotion in these conversations that if you add confusion and uncertainty and misinterpretations, you're just making it so much worse. Like, we're trying to be nice by not using the D word, but it really doesn't help.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think that when we use dead and death and dying, that term, I think it has become so taboo, so fearful, when you hear those words. And I think that's a key ingredient that I try to change. I talk to children. I do. I write coloring books so that we can discuss, what dying means. And I also show children through the garden how the stages of life in the garden, all your vegetables die and they go back to the earth and they get. So I try to do that, and I'm with you. I come from Texas, and it's where I was born and raised, and passed on, and I lost my mom, and you know those were words that I was not used to growing up as a child. I mean, I grew up on a farm, and we had to put cows and horses down on a weekly basis sometimes, depending if they got sick, if they went lame. And so we heard, oh, Sissy, she's gonna die today, or we're gonna have to, I had to put so and so down and they're dead. So as a kid, we always had the word death and dying, and we never said, oh, we lost a cow today, because everybody would say, oh, well, let's get in our trucks and go look for
Find
it.
Yeah,
So
some of it's just practice. I think back.
yeah,
I
it
don't know
is.
where I learned this in death and dying world, but early on, Gene Hirsch was one of my mentors in medical school, and he was watching me take a history, and it was a sexual history of somebody who had presented with a sexually transmitted disease, and I was getting all tripped up over like sexual contacts. And he said, "Look, after the visit, this is how I ask about sexual partners. I say, do you have sex with men, women, or both?" And that's just the phrase I use. And I use it so much that people don't really notice it. They just answer the question. I'm not nervous or
Yeah.
uncomfortable asking it. And I think primary care providers probably take sexual histories more often than they talk to people about death and dying because they're doing a good job of
Absolutely.
keeping their patient alive. And I think that's the problem that a lot of particularly young healthcare providers have. They just haven't seen that much death. They haven't talked about it, and it still feels awkward. And again, if it feels awkward to you as a clinician, it's going to feel awkward to the patient and family, and we don't really want to hit them with that.
Absolutely. There was a story. I work with a vet, and he's in palliative care right now. He's in congestive heart failure, and anyways, he went to the VA to talk to his palliative care team, and they were all young. He's 74. Anything below 50 is young to him.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
But
me too.
anyways, he wanted to talk to them about medical aid in dying as an option, even though he lives in Florida and he knows it wouldn't be available here. But he has family in California. So, he has made arrangements to be with his brother and perhaps do something like that when the time comes. And he said that he was so amazed that when he went and talked to his palliative care, that they were so openly conversative about that. They made it perfectly clear that it wasn't allowed here in Florida, of course. But they said, they used the word death, and they said, if that's how you see your dying going, of course we'll do whatever we can. We'll make arrangements, we'll hook you up with whoever you need to know in California. But they were also very logical. They said, you also have to understand and have a backup plan, because at that point, what happens if you can't fly? What happens if you can't get to California? So you should always have a backup plan. And when he came back, he said that that was the most real conversation, he had ever had in the history of going to the VA. And it made, when he told me, I said, that's clear progress. I said, because the fact that you talked about medical aid in dying in a state that didn't even allow it, and the clinicians were so young and they were so open ended in the conversation with you, and they were so real with you about, that's a great plan, but do you have something else? He said it just made him feel so at ease and so comfortable that you know his doctors and his care team were that open to any kind. He felt at that point he could talk about anything with them, and not have that um, judging or whatever comes from um, relationship.
Yeah.
So
And I usually tell learners that the bar is pretty low.
yeah,
I think, patients are so used to not being able to talk about death, dying, their future plans.
yeah,
If you walk into that room and you're willing to talk, you don't have to be perfect. You don't even have to
no,
be halfway good. You just have to have a willingness to show up
yeah,
and to listen. And you're already better than 99% of the docs that they've seen in their
absolutely,
lives. So I'm not
absolutely.
sure if that's inspiring or intimidating to the learners that I teach, but I think it's kind of giving them permission to go in there. And the other thing I'll tell them is that I have plenty of conversations that don't go well. And there are things that I say that I shouldn't have said, and vice versa. Like
Absolutely.
none of us is perfect, but just a willingness to show up and to talk and listen, that's 90% of the game.
And I always tell people, even if the conversation goes wrong, that's still progress, because now you know that that's off the table.
Yep.
That's you don't have to go back to that again. So,
Yep.
okay, let's move on a little bit. I'm going to kind of process over. I've gone a little bit over, but that's okay. My people don't mind too much. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about science meets compassion. Your book blends the rigorous of science, and I love the story part, the storytelling part. That was my favorite part about reading the book.
Thanks.
Um, why is that a combination? Why is that so important for this topic? Why did you put that into this book, that strong storytelling?
Well, there's actually a little bit of a story there too. I would say the short answer is I think storytelling is important for healthcare writing on any
Thank you.
topic. Like nobody really wants to read science all the time.
Yeah.
And I kind of got that indirectly from Oliver Sacks, who was using stories in medicine before it was cool, before it was popular. He arguably pioneered that genre of writing where there's some
Hmm.
science, but there's also a patient story, and that interaction was really interesting to him. I think that interaction between what's going on in the brain and the meaning that people make or don't make out of that. And just reading, I've been reading them just the last couple of weeks, his letters, which are collected letters from way back when he first arrived at the United States, long time ago, up until through his death. And he really spent a lot of time thinking about what's the right role for patient stories, and does that make it less medical? Does that make it less scientific? Does that help people understand? Does it detract? He really agonized over whether, when, and how to put stories in. Which is ironic because part of the reason I wrote this book actually was I was at a book signing in Union Square in New York years ago, and talked with Oliver Sacks briefly in this long line of people, and he asked me what I did. It's palliative care, and he said, "Oh, you should write a book about death. That's fascinating stuff." And so now, like, whatever it is, 15 years later, I finally have. But it's kind of ironic that we should mention that storytelling, which, I think many of us who write narrative medicine now kind of stole from or borrowed from people like Oliver Sacks, who are doing it really, really well for a long time. But it helps to make things more real in a way, less threatening in a way, gives people something to grab onto. And frankly, like, many of us have PTSD from wading through basic biology in high school and college, and nobody wants to go through that again. But if you leaven it with stories and you mix it, so I think they're real practical reasons to dilute that science with stories a bit.
Well, I agree with that theft. I think y'all should keep doing it. I don't say that often, but hey. um, okay. Can you share a story from your clinical experience that shaped your understanding of death?
I could think of a couple. One of the most surprising to me that really left a mark was I was a medical student. I went to Case Western in Cleveland, and this was probably my first clinical year, so third year of medical school. And man was admitted, really, really advanced coronary artery disease. His left main artery was about 99% occluded. So he was barely getting by, and that could close off at any moment. And I was taking history and physical because he was going to surgery the next day and needed pre-op clearance. And I guess I was on the general medicine service. And he had a cardiac arrest and died right as I was talking with him. And, a code was called, and we coded him, and he had no coronary blood flow at all at that point, and there was no prayer of bringing him back. This is a while ago. I think now we probably would have put him on bypass and taken him to the OR, maybe put him on a VAD. But we didn't have those options then, and so we tried to restart his heart, and we couldn't, and so he died. But what struck me was just how sudden it was. He was sitting in the bed, talking with me, laughing. We were talking about whether he would be able to eat dinner that night because he was going for surgery the next day, and talked about hospital food. And then all of a sudden he stopped talking, and then he was dead. So that suddenness really sort of was shocking and surprising, but also inspiring, that the line between life and death is so thin that somebody could be talking, laughing about bad hospital meatloaf one moment and then dead the other. I don't know if that sparked an interest in end-of-life care for me, but it definitely has influenced the way that I practice medicine, the way I look at patients, knowing that just hop that fence, and you can go from being alive to being dead in a matter of seconds. It's really, the life that we got is pretty robust in a lot of ways, but it's also really, really fragile.
Wow, that's a powerful story. I got goosebumps. So, okay. Um, as far as the cultural shift, and I'm going to close this down now. So these are the last couple of questions I have for you. Um, why do you think death is finally getting a seat at the healthcare table?
Well, uh, is it? I mean, I guess there are two answers to that. One is,
Okay.
I mean, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote about death and dying, was it 50 years ago? I should know this by heart. It's been a long time ago. And that was a bestseller. So it's been at the table for a while. I guess that's one answer. The other is it's still not really. I mean, I think clinicians and health systems still kind of give up on patients when they're dying, totally willing to push every button and be aggressive when there's a chance of a cure, but I think everybody's just not really sure what to do. Sure, we've got hospice, but hospice is not really a great solution for everybody all the time. Um, and I don't think our health system does nearly enough to support people who are dying and families who are dying. So I love it that you think that death has a seat at the table now, and you could certainly make an argument. I'm not being difficult. You could make an argument that yeah, it's more in the common culture and it's more a part of healthcare now than it was 50 years ago, for sure, definitely. I'm still not really sure it has a seat at the table. Maybe it shouldn't, honestly. I only say that because I think a lot of the people who focus on death and dying totally legitimately, but the time we spend and the money we spend on the last minutes of life um, take away from, or at least distract from, everything that goes before it. And by that I mean, yeah, we need to make death and dying better, more comfortable, more acceptable, easier to talk about. But everything that comes before that, like an older woman who's living at home, doesn't have caregivers, as she's
Yeah,
getting weaker and more frail, needs to go to a nursing home. Like, that's not death and dying, but that's kind of a failure.
yeah, I agree.
So, I mean, being able to focus on death and dying, I would feel better about the role that death and dying has and its seat at the table if we were also spending as much time talking about that woman whose like last moments of life might be okay, but the last year of life is not
Yeah,
because, yeah,
I agree. I think we are. I think we allow death in the room where the people are talking at the table, but we're in the nosebleed section.
yeah,
we're not going to get to actively participate in that conversation, but at least we're allowed in the room now.
yep, agreed.
And that is progress for me. I agree with you. I think it's a culmination. I feel the same way when we spend all this money on birth and the new home and the baby showers and the gender reveals and everything. And by all means, that's a beautiful thing. That ceremony, ritual, celebration. But it's also the part that comes after the birth. It's the life.
Yep,
And
yep,
I agree that it's a continuing it's a continuing movie. And yes, in every movie there is the last dramatic scene, whether it's the closing scene, and death is our closing scene, so to speak. But if you're not looking at, like you said, the last 2 years of their life, or and I'll use a homeless person as an example for what I did. Yes, they were, so by the time he did end up in the dying phase, yes, it was, they did everything they could, pain manage and everything, but that's all they looked at. You know what I'm saying? They didn't look at the last 5 years of his life,
yep,
being on the streets and not having people to, reach out and talk to him. And he, basically dropped out of society for the most part and was ignored by it for the most part. So I agree with you. I think in order for us to have a clear seat at the healthcare table, we kind of have to change. And this is nothing that's going to happen in my lifetime, but I think we have to change the system a little bit to invite more people to the table, to have an open discussion to figure out how we want to rebuild that system or implant something into the system that is currently missing. I think
yep,
that's
agreed.
the talk that needs to happen. Um, I think that, like you said, hospice. I I think hospice is a perfectly wonderful, wonderful situation. It's the one that we have, but it doesn't. There are people that go into hospice that that is nothing that they would have wanted, but there was no other choice or whatever wasn't else available. So I think we have to, again, I think we also have to look at the amount of people that are coming up dying too. I mean, we have 55 million baby boomers who are still going to be in the process of the dying process and end up dead.
Yep,
It's the largest population that, we have ever seen in the history of America. And I think that's something that we need to look at too, the amount of people, how many caregivers are we going to get, how many staff is going to be available. I mean, it's a whole genre of uh, sitting down and really hashing stuff out. And I don't think, I'm glad we've moved as far as we have, but I think we have a long way to go before we can sit there and say, okay, we've arrived.
Right. Okay.
So, okay. My last question. What do you hope readers take away from Undiscovered Country?
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully there's a better understanding of what actually happens in the last hours and minutes, but
Yeah.
really that's kind of an intermediary step. I'd feel much better if people reading this felt a little bit more confident, less scared, less bewildered, less overwhelmed, and a little bit more hopeful that this
Yeah.
is not the horrible experience that a lot of people
Well, after reading your book, I thought to myself, this is the kind of doctor that I would want on my palliative care team. So
Great, thanks.
it did resonate immensely with me, and that says a lot considering my background. I don't have anything against the AMA or the Medical Association, but when I was growing up, that was we were I come from a family of 10 kids, so my mom did not run to the doctor with every little thing, you know what I'm
Right.
saying?
Yep.
So for me it was different. We saw the doctors and stuff as more of a trauma, something that, my mom and my grandmother was a medicine woman, and so a lot of our stuff, it was herbal. If one of us got chicken pox, my mom just put us all in the room and we all got chicken pox. And but it also taught my mom a very valuable lesson too. Two of my brothers, when they did get chickenpox, they got such severe cases that my mom ended up taking them to the doctor, and we found out that they had an extremely low immune system to begin with. They were born with it. So, at that point, I saw the value in what the doctors could do, and, the just stuff that my mom and my grams would not have known if they hadn't taken that step. So, yes, I agree. Okay, before I throw in my closing, is there anything you'd like to add or say in closing?
Really, I think we've said pretty much everything. Just some reassurance that dying doesn't really have to be as bad or as scary as a lot of people think. It's sad for sure,
Yeah,
and that's enough though. It doesn't really have to be
that's what
scary,
it's supposed to
terrifying,
be.
fearful.
It's supposed to be sad, and it's supposed to be, all those feelings are part of the natural course, but the
Right.
fear and all that, I agree with you. If we could just dial that down a factor, I think we would just change one or two people's life, the end of life ending for them.
Yep.
And
I agree.
that's enough in my book. So,
Yep. I agree.
okay. Well, thank you
Thanks
so
so much.
much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And I'm going to go ahead and close it out. And I appreciate you taking the time with me.
Yeah, great to meet you.
So,
Really appreciate it. Look forward to
all
hearing this.
righty then.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Bye. That was David. That was Dr. David Casarett guiding us through the undiscovered country, a place we all will visit, but few dare to explore. If today's conversation helped you see death not as a failure, but as a vital part of life, then this episode did its job, and I thank you for tuning in. Undiscovered Country is available online. Um, it is a Simon and Schuster publication, but I'm sure you can find it on Amazon and all those places. Share this episode with someone who's ready to talk about dying and living with more clarity and courage. Also, please feel free to subscribe to Death Talk Unscripted, Blood and Bone, wherever you listen, and join us next time as we keep asking the questions that matter most. This is all about Death Talk. It's real and raw. And I want to thank you again for joining me and joining Dr. David Casarett. It was a privilege indeed having him here. So much love. It's okay to talk about death. You won't die from it.